Welcome to the debate. Imagine sitting at a High Lord's feast. You're drinking rich black wine, laughing with your co-conspirators, and feeling perfectly secure in your plot to overthrow the crown.
Right, a classic treasonous evening.
Exactly. But what if I told you that the most dangerous man in the world, the very man you are plotting against, is sitting right beside you?
Oh, man.
Yeah, wearing another man's face and, actively mapping out your doom. Today, we are opening a really blood-soaked, forbidden chapter of history.
We're looking at the year 212 AC.
Right. The Seven Kingdoms were locked in this sort of paranoid peace under King Aegon V, but the terrifying reality is that the realm was actually ruled from the shadows by his hand. The albino sorcerer, Lord Bloodraven.
And the tension in the realm at that time was absolute, which, brings us to the magnificent marble fortress of White Walls. Lord Ambrose Butterwell was hosting a wedding and a grand tourney.
With a crazy prize, right?
Yeah, a priceless petrified red and gold dragon's egg. But the attendees, like Houses Castaigne, Strickland, Sunderland, Peake, they were all former Blackfyre rebels.
Exactly.
So this wasn't a wedding at all. It was a hidden war council for the Second Blackfyre Rebellion.
Right, and our whole analysis today centers on Bloodraven's infiltration of this conspiracy. I'll be taking the stance that Bloodraven's use of dark sorcery to, walk among the traitors was an unparalleled masterstroke of psychological warfare.
Yeah, and I'll be arguing the opposite.
Natural.
I mean, my position is that this infiltration was a hubristic, unnecessarily dangerous game of shadows, one that inflicted brutal collateral damage and planted a cursed seed that would later ignite the tragedy at Summerhall.
Well, okay, we really have to start by dispelling this myth that wars are only fought with steel on an open battlefield, right?
Sure.
Bloodraven understood the sheer visceral trauma of the First Blackfyre Rebellion. I mean, he was at the Ruggrass Field. He saw tens of thousands of men slaughtered.
Yeah, a total bloodbath.
Exactly. So when the rumblings of a second rebellion started at White Walls, he was determined to sever the head of the snake before the armies even formed.
Right.
He didn't just, send a spy into the traitors' midst. He actually became the spy. He orchestrated, the most terrifying intelligence operation in Westerosi history.
But let's look at the mechanics of how he did it, right? Because the how really exposes the immense, terrifying risk here. He didn't just put on a cloak and sneak in.
No, he used esoteric lore.
Right. He used dark arts.
Yes, the Moonstone brooch. He used it as an anchor for a magical illusion, a glamour.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is, because a glamour doesn't actually alter the physical body. It basically folds light and manipulates the perception of the observer.
Right.
Through this dark art, Bloodraven disguised his bone-white skin, his silver hair, that famous crimson eye, and his birthmark.
The Raven Mark.
Exactly. He transformed into the mysterious, sardonic hedge knight, Sir Maynor Plum, and he just sat in their halls. He listened to their treasons.
Just absorbing it all.
Yeah. He identified every single lord who still harbored rebellion in their heart. And because of this perfect inside intelligence, when the sun rose over White Walls, the castle was entirely surrounded by the royal army.
Right.
Faced with Bloodraven's, terrifying omniscience, the rebellion collapsed without a single sword drawn in open war. I mean, it is a masterpiece of statecraft.
Well, you say masterpiece, but you're entirely glossing over the collateral damage there.
Am I?
Yes. You describe a bloodless victory, but that only works if you don't count the blood of the innocent people Bloodraven treated as, disposable cover for his operation.
Okay, but
While he was playing his psychological games in the shadows, White Walls was spiraling into absolute chaos.
a localized chaos, though, contained within the castle walls.
Contained? Tell that to Sir Glendon Ball. Because Bloodraven allowed this tourney to proceed to its absolute breaking point, this young, bastard-born hedge knight was violently framed for the theft of that priceless dragon's egg.
Well, Lord Peake did that.
Yeah, but Lord Peake dragged him to the dungeons and brutally tortured him on the rack while Bloodraven just watched.
Okay, but
Or look at the towering hedge knight, Sir Duncan the Tall. Dunk enters the lists and is defeated by a mercenary known as the Snail Knight, Why? Because the Snail Knight was bribed to assassinate him during the joust.
That was a risk of the tourney.
And shortly after, Dunk is ambushed in the dark by an unhinged, jealous loyalist. He nearly bleeds to death down a well.
Right, and Bloodraven, disguised as Plum, stepped out of the shadows to bind Dunk's wounds and save him.
After the damage was done, that's the terrifying part here. Bloodraven was standing right there in the darkness, watching a loyal man get butchered.
That's been dramatic.
He had the power to stop the violence at any moment. The royal army was already marching on white walls. He didn't need the tourney to happen to trap them.
Wait, let's unpack that. Because I think you're fundamentally misunderstanding the logistics of rooting out a conspiracy.
How so?
You say he didn't need the tourney to happen because the army was already marching, but think about it medically, okay?
Okay.
If a patient is suffering from a deep systemic infection, a physician will often allow a deadly fever to peak in order to completely draw out the disease and definitively identify it.
I mean, sure, but
Yes, the fever is agonizing for the patient, but if you suppress it too early, you never find the root cause, and the rot remains.
I just don't accept that this was the only cure. You expose rot through targeted surgical strikes, not by letting the fever ravage the body.
How, though? If Bloodraven's army arrives before the tourney, what happens?
They arrest the conspirators.
No, Lord Butterwell throws his hands up and says, it's just a wedding. Lord Peake says, I was just visiting an old friend.
Right.
And the charismatic rebel leader, John the Fiddler, who we know was secretly Daemon to Blackfyre, remains just a fiddler.
True.
If you strike too early, the rats scatter back into the walls. They hide their treason, they go back to their castles, and they wait 5 years to launch a war that kills 50,000 people.
Yeah, but
Bloodraven absorbs the moral impurity of letting a few individuals suffer locally so the Riverlands wouldn't have to burn. He needed the Lords of the Realm to commit their treason openly. He needed them to feel safe enough to act.
But look at the cost of letting them feel safe. It wasn't just mercenaries and bastard knights in danger. The most horrifying variable in Bloodraven's entire operation was Prince Aegon Targaryen.
Egg?
Yes, Egg. We are talking about the 10-year-old royal heir. Egg was left completely exposed in a castle filled to the brim with seasoned, bitter veterans who absolutely despised his family.
To be fair, Bloodraven didn't invite Egg to White Walls. Dunk and Egg just wandered into that situation on their own.
But Bloodraven knew they were there.
Yes.
And he still let the trap close around them. When the dragon's egg went missing and the paranoia of the rebels reached a fever pitch, Lord Butterwell cornered young Egg.
In the Sept, right?
Yeah. Butterwell was a terrified man realizing his treason was unraveling. Do you realize how close the Targaryen dynasty came to being severed right there in the Sept?
It was a tense moment.
Egg had to desperately flash his golden royal signet ring, pulling off basically the greatest bluff in Westerosi history just to survive.
And he did it brilliantly.
He gambled his life on the hope that Butterwell was too cowardly to slaughter a royal prince. If Butterwell had reacted violently, which, cornered, terrified men do, the boy would have been murdered. Bloodraven risked the succession of the Iron Throne just to let his fever peak.
See, you're focusing entirely on the danger. But look at the results. You look at Prince Aegon in that Sept, and you see a victim of extreme endangerment.
Because he was.
I look at him and I see the forging of a king.
A 10-year-old should not be used as an anvil for statecraft.
But this is Westeros. Weakness invites absolute destruction. We have to consider the esoteric layer here, too. The magic.
Here we go.
Daemon Blackfyre had a prophetic dragon dream, right? A vision that a dragon would hatch at White Walls. Daemon arrogantly believed this meant he would claim the petrified egg and rise as the Black Dragon.
Right, that was his whole motivation.
But Bloodraven understood the fluid, treacherous nature of prophecy far better than Daemon did. The physical egg didn't hatch that day, but Egg himself hatched.
That is pure survivor's bias.
Is it, though? He walked into White Walls as a frightened, disguised squire. He walked out as a confident prince of the realm, wielding his authority to utterly dominate Lord Butterwell and stall the entire rebellion.
Barely.
I'll ask you this. Does sheltering a future king not create a weak king? Aegon V eventually became one of the most beloved and effective kings in history precisely because of this crucible.
I disagree.
This trial by fire at the Traitor's Tourney taught him from the ground up how ruthless and dangerous the Lords of Westeros truly were.
And my counter is that a forge can also melt the iron entirely. Aegon survived by the skin of his teeth and only because Sir Duncan the Tall had to march into a great hall, literally bleeding to death, to demand a trial by combat.
True.
Which leads to the climax of this so-called masterstroke. The rebellion wasn't defeated by Bloodraven's magic alone. It hinged on Dunk demanding a trial and the tortured, half-dead Sir Glendon Ball being forced to ride against Daemon Blackfyre.
Which provided the most brilliantly humiliating resolution possible. This is where Bloodraven's patience pays off in dividends. Daemon Blackfyre, the great hope of the rebels, rides against a battered, scapegoated bastard hedge knight. And Glendon Ball punches the Black Dragon right off his horse, into the dirt.
It was a huge shock.
Right in front of every lord who swore to bleed for him.
It was an incredible upset, I'll give you that.
It wasn't just an upset, though. It was an ideological crushing. The Black Dragon was made to look weak, foolish, and entirely incompetent.
Yeah, it destroyed his mystique.
If Bloodraven had just marched in and executed Daemon on day one, Daemon becomes a martyr. Songs are sung about his bravery. By letting the tourney play out, Bloodraven let Daemon humiliate himself.
Okay, but...
And the true genius of the statecraft reveals itself immediately after. Bloodraven drops the plum disguise, rides in, and arrests Daemon. But he doesn't take his head.
No, he doesn't.
He keeps him alive as a hostage in King's Landing. Why? Specifically to prevent the Blackfyre loyalists across the Narrow Sea from crowning Daemon's younger brother. It is checkmate in 3 moves.
Right.
And to top it off, Bloodraven's hidden agents successfully steal the ultimate prize, the petrified dragon's egg, removing it from the board entirely.
Hold on. You are calling the theft of the dragon's egg the final victory, but I argue that stealing that egg was a fatal, catastrophic mistake that haunts the Targaryen dynasty to this day.
What? He secured a weapon of mass symbolic power. How is that a mistake?
Because he didn't destroy it. Yes, the physical egg was lost to the shadows by Bloodraven's agents, but we know the dark history that follows.
Well,
it didn't stay lost. That very egg, steeped in the blood, torture, and dark magic of White Walls, eventually found its way into King Aegon V's hands decades later.
That's a bit of a leap.
Is it? The obsession with hatching that egg, an obsession born in the prophetic fires of the Second Blackfyre Rebellion, directly caused the tragedy at Summerhall.
Oh, come on.
No. Bloodraven didn't secure the realm's future at White Walls. He simply pocketed the detonator for the Targaryen family's ultimate destruction.
I have to fiercely challenge that attribution of blame.
Why?
You are connecting dots across decades to condemn a man for a tragedy he wasn't even present for. Look, you're blaming the miner who extracts iron from the earth for a murder committed with a sword 30 years later.
Magic isn't iron, though. Magic has a memory.
But Bloodraven removed the egg from a faction of traitors. He neutralized the immediate threat. You cannot blame the architect of the peace in 212 AC for the tragic magical hubris of King Aegon years in the future.
Yes, you can.
The tragedy of Summerhall was a result of Aegon's desperate grown man desire to bring dragons back to the world to enforce his political reforms. That was Aegon's choice, not a curse placed by Bloodraven at a tourney in his youth.
You're separating the magic from the politics, but Bloodraven is the one who fused them in the first place.
He used what he had to.
He wasn't extracting neutral iron. He was manipulating highly volatile prophetic magic. He utilized dark sorcery to disguise himself as Maynard Plum. He weaponized prophecy, allowing Daemon's dragon dreams to lure the traitors in.
To trap them.
When you weave dark magic so intimately into the fabric of statecraft, the blowback is never just political. It is existential. By making the dragon's egg the focal point of his shadowy victory, he imbued it with a dark legacy.
That's very poetic, but...
It taught young Aegon that magic, deception, and power are inextricably linked. That is the lesson Aegon internalized and eventually took to Summerhall. The flames of White Walls were just delayed.
Well, it's a compelling, tragic narrative, I'll give you that. But the empirical evidence of history shows that Bloodraven's methods worked. Let's look at the immediate, undeniable aftermath.
Okay.
When the sun rose and the war horns blew, Bloodraven rode into the castle in his true, terrifying albino form, surrounded by the raven's teeth. Every single rebel lord surrendered.
Out of sheer terror.
But they surrendered. House Butterwell, House Peake, Costain, Strickland, the entire coalition collapsed without a single volley of arrows. You speak of the existential blowback of magic, but I am looking at the practical reality of thousands of lives saved.
At what cost, though?
A conventional war would have seen farmers conscripted, fields burned, and the riverlands drowned in blood. Bloodraven absorbed the moral impurity of espionage, deception, and dark magic so the small folk wouldn't have to absorb the devastation of war. He remains the most effective player in the Game of Thrones because he understood a fundamental truth. Breaking an enemy's mind is infinitely more efficient than breaking their armies.
And I maintain that extreme efficiency is not a justification for unchecked cruelty. Yes, the lords surrendered, but at what cost to the soul of the realm?
The realm survived.
But the torture of Glendon Ball, the near death of Sir Duncan, the psychological terror inflicted on a 10-year-old child, these are not rounding errors in a ledger of statecraft.
They were necessary evils.
They are the defining features of a terrifying, unaccountable regime. Bloodraven operated with a level of hubris that assumed he could perfectly control the chaotic, violent nature of men and magic.
He mostly did.
He created a world where trust was utterly annihilated, where your closest confidant at a feast could literally be a sorcerer wearing an illusion. He crushed the rebellion, yes, but he sowed the seeds of the Targaryen dynasty's darkest days. The creation of a cursed missing artifact at White Walls proves that you cannot play with shadows without eventually being consumed by them.
Well, as we bring our analysis to a close, our perspectives on this forbidden lore clearly remain sharply divided.
Definitely.
By stepping into the darkness himself and utilizing every tool at his disposal, from the Thousand Eyes and One to the Moonstone Glamour, he exposed the deepest rot of the Second Blackfyre Rebellion.
Right.
He neutralized it with a precision that conventional warfare could never achieve, basically bearing the weight of being the monster so the realm could have peace.
And I stand by the reality that peace built on torture, deception, and volatile dark magic is inherently unstable. Bloodraven's methods treated human lives as entirely expendable variables in an arcane equation.
I hear you.
He left behind a dangerous magical legacy, one that would eventually claim the very lives he supposedly sought to protect, proving that you really cannot weaponize prophecy without getting burned.
Well, what we undeniably agree upon is that the events at the Traitor's Tourney perfectly encapsulate the terrifying nature of power in Westeros.
Oh, absolutely.
It is a world where magic, prophecy, and statecraft are inextricably and often fatally intertwined. The line between a visionary protector and a dark sorcerer is razor thin, and perhaps depends entirely on who survives to write the archives.
Indeed. And it leaves us staring into the ashes of that history, uncovering the dangerous secrets the world tried to hide. We know what happened to the men at White Walls, but the artifact that drove them all to the brink of destruction, that remains a mystery.
Exactly. What truly happened to that petrified red and gold dragon's egg in the years before Summerhall? There are far more brutal, hidden secrets in this lore waiting to be uncovered, and we leave it to you to weigh the true cost of peace in the Seven Kingdoms.
Until then, remember to look closely at the shadows.
Because you never truly know if the man sitting beside you drinking your wine is a friend, a traitor, or the architect of your doom.